Welcome back. In this video, we're going to add the tick function to the character class. Now, a tick function is a function that will call each frame and will pass in delta time as a float value, and we'll use this function to update all variables on the character class that need to be updated every frame. Let's dive in. Now, our tick function is going to take care of things that happen every frame. These are things that we place in the while loop. Let's take a look at what those are. For one, we have all the code handling the input, such as key presses. Then we're updating our animation variables, and finally, we're drawing the texture to the screen. So there are a couple of variables that we'll need to add to the character class. For one, in our movement code, we're using this speed variable, so we'll need to add speed to the character class. And also, here in Draw Texture Pro, we're using this rectangle called dest, and dest uses this night pause variable. This is simply the screen position that we're drawing the character to on the screen. And if we scroll up and see how we defined that, we initialized it using the dimensions of the window. Now, in the character class, we created a vector too called screen pause, and that's going to store this information for drawing the character to the center of the screen. Now, this value also depends on the dimensions of the texture, which means that that texture has to be initialized as well. Remember, we added texture 2Ds to the character class, so we can make sure those are initialized. So we have a few things to take care of before we can make our tick function. So first, let's add our speed variable. We'll add that right here at the bottom of the private section. We'll make this a const float called speed, and we'll initialize it to 4.f. Next, we need to initialize the texture 2Ds, and we can do that here using braced initialization. So for texture, we'll simply call load texture, and the texture we'll load is characters / night idle sprite sheet.png. We'll go ahead and initialize idle to the same thing, and for run, we'll initialize it to night run sprite sheet. So now these texture 2D variables will be initialized with values. Next, we need a function to set our screen pause, which is dependent on the window dimensions. So let's create a public function for that. It's going to be void, and we'll call this setScreenPause. And this function is going to take two integers. The first will be for the window width, which we'll call winWidth. The second will be for the window height, so we'll call this one winHeight. Now we saw that we can define the function here in the character class, but if we keep doing this with all our functions, the character class is going to get really crowded. But it just so happens that we can define a function outside of the class. To do that, we add the semicolon to the function prototype. And then we scroll down to a section outside the class to define it. We paste the function prototype, only we need to tell the compiler that this function belongs to the character class, and we do that by adding character with a double colon just before the function name. Doing this is called fully qualifying the function name, and the two colons is known as the scope resolution operator.
So what happens if you don't fully qualify the function? Well, you're going to create a new function called setScreenPause, and this function does not belong to the character class. This can cause some unexpected behavior. If you have a character object and you attempt to call its setScreenPause function and it doesn't have a definition, you'll get an error because the function definition will not be found.
Next, we remove the semicolon and we add a function body. And now we can define this function outside the character class. Now we need to give screenPause a value. So we're going to say screenPause equals followed by braces. Now for the X and Y, we're going to take a look at night pause. Let's go ahead and copy these two lines, and we'll scroll up and paste them here. Now we're using window width here, but in this function, it's an input parameter called winWidth. So we're going to replace window width with winWidth. Likewise, window height is going to be replaced with our input parameter winHeight. And next, we're using this texture that we had called night, but this is in the character class. And the character class is using a texture 2D called texture. So we're going to replace night with texture. And now we have a function that will initialize screen pause to the correct value using the window dimensions. Now let's add our semicolon to the end of this, and then we're done. Now we're ready to create the tick function in the character class. So let's scroll up to the public section and add the tick function. This will be a void function called tick, and it's going to take a float called delta time. Now, just like we did with set screen pause, we're going to define this outside the character function. So we'll copy this and scroll down just after set screen pause and paste it. Now we need to fully qualify this function with the character class name and the scope resolution operator. Next, we'll add a function body, and now we have the tick function. We're ready to add the code to this function that we need to call each frame, and that's going to be down here in the while loop. First, we have our code for handling inputs. So let's copy this code and scroll up to the tick function and paste it in. Now, once we've pasted it, the formatting is all messed up. But there's a shortcut to format the code in this document. For Windows, it's Shift-Alt-F. On Mac, it's Shift-Option-F, and on Linux, it's Control-Shift-I. Now, it does place our compact if statements on a separate line, but that's okay. This is valid. If you have only a single line in your if statement, the curly braces are optional, even if you place that statement on the next line. So we can keep this formatting. Now, we're no longer using map pause. This is inside the tick function, which is in the character class, so we're going to use the character's world pause vector. And instead of subtracting direction, we're going to add direction, because we're changing the character's world position. So this comment will now say, world pause equals world pause plus direction, which means instead of map pause, we're going to use world pause, and instead of vector2 subtract, we're going to use vector2 add. Now what we're adding is world pause plus this quantity, which is the normalized direction scaled by speed. Now we're also updating the texture, but since we're now in the character class, we don't have a night variable. We're now using the texture 2D called texture instead. Now, if direction is not 0, this means we need to be using the run sprite sheet, so we're going to set texture to run. And in the else case, we should be using the idle sprite sheet, so we're going to be setting texture to idle. Just like that. Okay, so we've created the tick function and we've added some functionality to it. For your challenge, you're going to add the animation code to the tick function. Take a look at the while loop and see how we're updating the animation variables for the animation frame. Go ahead and add that functionality to the character's tick function. Pause the video and do this now. Okay, so we're going to scroll down to the while loop where we have our animation variables. Let's go ahead and copy these, and then we'll scroll back up to the tick function, and we'll paste them in right here. Now again, the formatting is all messed up, so we're going to use Shift-Alt-F to format the document. On Mac, it's Shift-Option-F, and on Linux, it's Control-Shift-I. So now we have our animation variables. Now, in the tick function, we have this input parameter called delta time. So we don't need to call getFrameTime here when updating running time. We can simply use delta time. Awesome. That's going to be enough for this video. In the next video, we'll finish the tick function. So in summary, we added a tick function to the character class, and we added some character code to that function, so we no longer need it in the main function. In the next video, we'll finish moving the character code into the tick function, and then we'll create an actual variable of the character type. I'll see you soon.